Procurement is somehow frequently associated with a very unglamorous role in a company filled with mundane tasks all about getting the products that you need from your suppliers. However, it has been shown that this is a very misguided impression, and in fact, the team of procurement is often very underappreciated. Today, we are honored to be joined by Christian Schuh, the Managing Director and Senior Partner at BCG, to discuss this topic, which is also the topic in his new book, Profit from the Source. Christian, thank you very much for joining us here today. And as always, we'd love for you to begin to introduce yourself to our audiences before we jump into this issue at hand.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. So I've been a procurement consultant for 27 years now. And I started my consulting career back in 1995 with a procurement project at Mercedes-Benz in Germany. And then I was super lucky as I got to work with the very same team that 10 years prior had invented global sourcing together with Ignacio Lopez at General Motors. And with this absolutely unique experience, I spent the subsequent 15 years in the automotive industry working for car makers all over the world. And during that time, I did start writing books. And one of these books, The Purchasing Chessboard, got me into the tech industry. So I pretty much spent the period from 2011 to 2018 working for PC makers in the US and the suppliers in the one like Foxconn. And there I got deeply involved with managing the semiconductor supply chain. And today I'm leveraging this experience mostly for helping companies in automotive, engineering, and defense. And I continue producing content. And so two pieces. One is the new book, Profit from the Source, that you pointed out, Nicole. And also I'm hosting a YouTube channel called Procurement in the Park.
Fantastic, Christian. Thank you very much again for being with us here today. And I just want to jump straight to it. So one of the things that you mentioned in your book is how a CEO generally spends about 1% of his or her time on procurement, yet often more than half the budget of a company goes to procurement. So how come that procurement has become so essentially unworthy of a CEO's attention, and what differences or what changes would you propose to essentially this time allocation of the CEO?
I think this has an educational reason and a cultural reason. So, I mean, if you think about, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, so CEOs are typically graduates of business schools. And now, if you reflect what is being taught in business schools, so it's finance, marketing, and sales, and that's, I think, mostly it, right? I mean, maybe this has changed now with the pandemic and the supply chain crisis, but the current cohorts of CEOs didn't have that experience. So with all likelihood, they launched their careers in finance, marketing, and sales, and this is the experience. So they never really experienced this in their careers firsthand. And I think if you look at TV, books, movies, also doesn't help, right? So you have Mad Men and The Wolf of Wall Street, but at least I'm not aware of any Hollywood blockbuster where the hero or the villain is a CPO, right? So also doesn't help. And I mean, we have thought about what would be the right time allocation, right? So 1%, by the way, translates into 7 minutes per day. So this is definitely not enough. So our recommendations to CEOs would be 20-25% of the time spent on suppliers.
Jonas, do you agree with this essentially time allocation of a CEO for procurement?
I do agree that procurement is very important, and it's one of the many topics where that I would say underappreciated. Supply chain is also underappreciated, but also I would say digital and plenty of other things. So the way I see that is that I mean, one of the things that worries me is that to expect too much from the CEO, so that the CEO is like I would say an 360-degree hero that capable of dealing with everything. I believe, I mean, my approach would be, or at least the one that I see, is that there are so many things that demand the attention of the CEO that at some point you need more like a meta solution. So, you know, something that is not for this problem, but this class of problems. And if, I mean, for me, that's part of the functions that are not so glamorous. You know, I would say procurement is one, supply chain is one, logistic is another one. So there is a whole series of things that are not super glamorous, but and yet it makes an enormous difference at the end of the day in terms of quality of service, cost, and overall efficiency of the company. So my take on that is that yes, it requires more attention, but I believe that one way for the CEO to actually tackle this problem is to do more on the employer brand so that they can get better people to fill those positions. And that's, I believe, one of the recipe of those, you know, very successful companies. We could say, you know, Apple would be one of them, is that they managed to hire truly exceptional people. You know, it was not just people think of Steve Jobs, but the reality was Steve Jobs, like a magnet, managed to attract dozens of incredibly talented people. And then, yes, one of them was an incredibly talented chief procurement officer who rise to become the successor of Steve Jobs. But you see, if I circle back, is this capacity to attract talent, I would say, super attractive talent, including for somewhat unattractive position. That would be, you know, my take for the CEO, which is a slightly different compared to allocate 20% of your time on procurement.
So you're thinking more time allocation to the, well, hiring process?
I don't know. I mean, if we take 20%, I mean, maybe Christian could, you know, object with me, but we have digital, people would say 20%. Then you have, obviously, your sales. You can't drop completely your sales. It would be unreasonable to say you don't spend, you know, at least 10%, marketing 10%. And then you have digital, or maybe I said it again, I said it already, etc. So in the end, there is only 100%, you know, of the time of CEO. And it's very tough. I mean, I think one of the key challenges, the way I see that is that the market really demands a lot from the top management. And I'm more into how can we do so that it's less demanding for the very top, so that the company can perform even if the very top is not the heroes that we would like to have. But that would be, you know, my take on that.
Christian, what do you think?
I think we need to a little bit to differentiate what can be solved with logic and what can be addressed with relationships, right? And maybe now I'm unjust to digital, but I believe at least so that digital is something that can be solved with logic mostly. So in digital, it's probably sufficient if the CEO finds a leader who has all the capabilities and talents required to fulfill the role, that takes care of this and then just reports on to the CEO on progress, right? Fully empowered by the CEO, but maybe doesn't need the CEO so much to build relationships. I think this is different when we talk about customers, especially in a B2B environment. Maybe not so much in B2C, but in B2B, definitely customers. So customers demand to see the CEO, right? When needed at special events. And I think the same is true for procurement, right? So procurement cannot be solved with logic alone. So procurement very much depends on the relationship, not with everyone, right? So I mean, a typically discrete manufacturing company has thousands of direct material suppliers, right? So we're not asking the CEO to spend time with all of these suppliers. But the ask here is that the CEO spends quality time with the suppliers that matter, right? And suppliers that matter basically are two types of suppliers. So one is easy to find. So these are the currently big suppliers. And again, so rule of thumb, in discrete manufacturing industries, 20 to 40 suppliers account for half of the spend. And that's manageable, right? So and then maybe not all of them are super important, but then there's another group of super important suppliers that the company may not yet have any business with yet today, but are super important for the future. So take an automotive company, a car maker. So if you look at their biggest suppliers today, a lot of these suppliers will be somehow involved with internal combustion engines, right? And we know that this is not the future. And the future is a completely different class of suppliers. So what we are recommending, demanding CEOs to do is to build strong relationships to the CEOs of the suppliers who are important today, of the suppliers who will be super important in the future. Build these relationships, but in strong alignment with procurement, so strong vertical alignment, strong horizontal alignment across functions. So not just go every now and then and play golf with the other CEO and discuss something, right? But do something that is orchestrated by the CPO. And just one more minute, right? So if you look at the semiconductor crisis, I think CEOs found this out the hard way, right? Because then they were calling companies, super important companies making semiconductors where they had no relationship whatsoever. So suddenly they found themselves in the role of a beggar with the head in hand asking for parts, and that's not good.
Indeed, actually, I want to ask or elaborate more on this importance of simply this human relationship between suppliers and the procurement team. And before I get to that, though, I also want to mention the role of the CPO, so the Chief Procurement Officer. And you also mentioned that the CPO should get the responsibility for the whole product lifecycle, so end to end. And if he or she is given that responsibility, how will that affect his or her behavior? Or change his or her behavior?
I mean, right now, if you look at typically discrete manufacturing industries companies, engineering is figuring out how the product should look like. Then procurement comes in and essentially is asked to find a good price for this. So, yeah, I mean, again, if you come back to the automotive industry example, if we are in the evolution, the gradual evolution of the internal combustion engine, this might be fine. Probably not ideal, but at the same time won't kill you, right? And your competitors are very much doing the same. But now we are in this transition where suddenly we're moving to electric powertrains, autonomous driving. So you need to bring a lot of electrics and electronics into the company. So now I ask you, what miracle enabled the engineers to suddenly become world-class in this completely new topic, right? It's probably didn't happen. So if we follow this model, we will do subpar projects, subpar products, right? So it's super important if we want to harness the innovation of suppliers to bring the supply innovation in super early in the product life cycle. So basically, as soon as product marketing people and engineers start even thinking about a product, contemplating a product, procurement needs to be there and needs to guide the process. Yeah, I mean, with this, the CPO would very much migrate from a marginal position in the company to a super central position in the company with a much wider mandate, right? I mean, I like to contrast this, like in the old world, procurement is expected to deliver low cost. And in a new world, right, procurement is expected to deliver profitable growth, which sounds similar, but is something completely different. So profitable growth means that the CPO ensures that the company is providing the right products with the right innovation from the right supplier.
Janice, what do you think about this profitable growth versus just the smallest cost?
So if I revisit a little bit, the sort of elements, it's interesting because for me, if I look at the automotive industry and their problems with their procurement of semiconductors, the way I see that is that in 2020, essentially, a large number of car companies in the US and in Europe did essentially cancel their slots for founders. So essentially, they are manufacturing companies, and they just did cancel. And because they were thinking that essentially the automotive market would shrink with the lockdowns. It did not happen. And where I believe the strategic analysis was very plainly incorrect was that once you give up a slot, the founder just give the slot to another company. And that can be, there was plenty of other needs for plenty of other things. And so when essentially they realized that the market wasn't stopping, they realized that they wanted to reacquire their slots, but they were all gone. So here we are touching something that is just one point, which is procurement need a very tight integration into the sort of risk analysis of the company. And here we have a problem, I believe, of culture where I don't see procurement teams doing, I would say, detailed quantitative risk analysis. So that's also that's part of the culture. That's part of, and also this is part when you, I believe, a car nowadays has something like 50 processors in it. So there is the degree of complexity is, and you may end up with something like a dozen of suppliers. So the degree of complexity is high, and the sort of tooling and instrumentation of those processes is very, very lacking. That's the problem of having something that is very much, I would say, relationship driven, is that the hardcore quantitative analysis of the risk assessment, what is it that you create in terms of risk if you decide to give up your slot. I have seen very, very few companies that can that quantitatively assess those things. So they can take drastic move where they cut, the supply on something, but the sort of quantitative analysis, which is what if we need to reactivate this slot, what will happen? It's not quantified, and so this whole industry realized essentially 12 months down the road that they had given up their slots and that there were a lot of other people, mostly the video games industry and the crypto mining industry, who had happily taken over all those slots for those founders in essentially in Asia. So that really, part of the problem. Second part is procurement about when you start looking about integrating the procurement into the very design of the product, suddenly you have also a problem of culture, which is suddenly procurement becomes as much a problem of hard engineering as much as a problem of relationship with the suppliers, because then your input needs to go at the heart of the product, so that the product itself is engineered differently, so that you can get the cheaper supplier or the cheaper solution. And again, I see that those two things, quantitative risk assessment and hard collaboration on hard engineering, requires, I would say, procurement teams that are, I would say, very talented people. I mean, suddenly it's not about having people that can play tough. It is about having people that can be very, very smart. I would say at a technical level, and so for most companies, I believe one of the struggle is that the sort of procurement teams are absolutely not, I would say, very smart, talented engineers that are capable of doing fancy quantitative risk assessment, and they are not either the sort of teams that can do fancy back of the envelope soft engineering to identify the spot that would generate the most of the savings. So I'm not saying this is not the right path. I'm just saying that there is like an entire challenge to lift the sort of competencies that you have compared to achieve those goals.
let's talk about risk management and quantitative analysis, and let's stick to the semiconductor crisis, right? So the mind-blowing thing is that this is not the first semiconductor crisis. So
Yeah.
the semiconductor crisis come every 3 to 5 years, right? The previous one was 2018, albeit not as severe as this one. Now you have to ask yourself, what have companies learned from the previous ones? So judging harshly, I would say nothing, right? So they have learned that it blows over, right? So then you can continue like before. So broadly speaking, companies in traditional industries, so including car makers, but almost everything else, right? So what they have done is they delegated the interface to this strange new tech ecosystem to the tier one suppliers. And they let the tier one suppliers select which semiconductors to use for a given task, select the suppliers, and the suppliers, the tier one suppliers, optimized along two vectors: lowest cost for them and maximum convenience. And the result was for car makers an unmanageable zoo of semiconductors. So, and at the beginning of the crisis, of this semiconductor crisis, car makers, generally speaking, did not know which semiconductors are being used by the tier one suppliers and put into their cars. They did not know the companies making the semiconductors, and they had zero relationship to the companies making the semiconductors. So, and now they were scrambling, oh my God, what do we have in the BOM? Tier one supplier, please tell us what it is. And then tier one suppliers gave them information, was mostly wrong and so, right? And this was really playing catch up. So, I mean, yeah, you could blame procurement alone for this situation, but I think this goes much deeper. This is a very deep cultural problem where companies simply want to stay in their comfort zone, right? Which is typically more mechanically, electromechanically, and this new stuff, let's outsource all the hassle to other companies. Now, where I disagree with your Johannes is the diagnostic on what happened in 2020. So my story is a little bit different. So the car makers went into shutdown of the factories in like April, May 2020 timeframe, right? And then they communicated to the tier one suppliers that to a large extent they will catch up in 2020. So they will work over summer and so on, right? And the market will pick up. The tier one suppliers didn't believe it. So the CFOs of the tier one suppliers were concerned about building up inventory for semiconductors, and the tier one suppliers canceled the slots, and then which then were happily picked up by other companies, which then comes back. I think again this falls into a kind of a data analytics problem, right? But also in a relationship problem. So what is the level of trust between the OEM and the tier one supplier, right? So we're back to relationship.
I agree, and here typically we had the problem of a risk of inventory where the tier one supplier had the option to basically keep buying semiconductor, not the rest, just this part, because those parts were really the one that were, where they were lacking good options. Because you're completely right about having, I would say, the successive crisis in semiconductor, and I believe that the core reason for that is fairly simple. Investment to have production capacity in semiconductor industry is absolutely gigantic. I think TSMC has announced they will invest over the next 10 years 500 billions, I say billions dollars, I believe this is pretty much right. So the investment are absolutely enormous. And then that's why, and then once you have the products, they are fairly cheap, once the investment are made, cheap to produce, so the marginal cost is not that large. But then you have to reserve the capacity, because if you don't, somebody step in and take it for you. And so I believe indeed people are making the mistakes. And if we go back to your case, I believe your analysis is exactly the one that match and that match mine. And here we have the problem of the stock in the tier one, who is how do we somehow share the risk of keeping this stock, because here indeed the car manufacturers were essentially shutting down I would say for an indefinite amount of time, and the tier one was facing a situation of either take the whole risk for them but none of the reward, because obviously they were not being paid by the car manufacturer in any way to preserve the option to restart at any point of time. So there was the problem of negotiating a bit the price of the optionality. And you see here we are getting into the realm of quantitative risk analysis. In finance people do that all the time, is you can buy options. The fact that I may or may not do something, and my hesitation has a price. But this is a sort of very sophisticated negotiation. Suddenly it's not about the old school procurement, give me the lowest price per unit period, and maybe an MOQ, minimum order quantity. It is negotiating options. I would say it is relatively complex financial instrument, not super complex, but more complex. And that requires maybe, one of the challenges, I believe you're right. This is the place where the direction that those companies should go. But I see the main challenge is it may, to a large extent, require new, I would say, new classes of procurement teams. It's not the same level of game that is being played in terms of procurement when you go into negotiating your options and planning for many scenarios and how to ensure that your suppliers are properly incentivized to cover for not one scenario but many scenarios.
But I think again this has an analytical angle that you outlined, but again is a relationship angle. So imagine the CEO discussion that I outlined before. So if the CEOs of the car makers had this very good relationship to the CEOs of the top suppliers, the current 30 to 40 top suppliers that account for half of the spend, which probably those are the ones that have the semiconductors, right? So in brackets, and then had an agreement with them to say, okay, with you guys, we don't push you through all these negotiations and business award things. With you, we run on a long wave, and we incentivize you on the performance of our company. So make sure that we can sell the best products at the highest price, at the highest volume to our customers, and we will incentivize you for that, right? And then maybe now I'm speculating, maybe then the tier one suppliers would have taken a different approach in 2020. Say, okay, for those companies, those customers where we have this arrangement, we continue stocking semiconductors, even though they forgot telling us that, maybe.
Yeah.
So speaking of this old school approach to suppliers, is essentially playing hardball and only going for the cheapest suppliers, is that always a bad strategy, Christian?
No, I think you can do it, right? So people sometimes misunderstand me like going soft on all suppliers, right? Or being collaborative with all suppliers. I'm almost saying the opposite, right? I'm saying figure out who of your suppliers really make a difference. And it's a small number, right? It's probably the 30 or 40 I talked about, so which are big today, and then maybe the same number of suppliers that will be super important in the future. But having said this, I'm also saying that all the others don't matter, really.
So you adjust your relationship to the supplier based on how important they are.
Totally transactional with all the others, right? So let's do something very simple. We measure KPIs. So what is the price performance? What is the delivery performance? What is the quality performance? What is their sustainability performance? Maybe something else, right? We measure this. So if they increase in the KPIs, they get a bigger share of the business. If they decrease, they get a lower share of the business. That's it, right? No negotiation, nothing, right? No interaction, no human interaction, nothing, right? So you can completely automate this. And then coming back to Johannes' point, right, about hiring star people into procurement, right? Because if you do this, if you do away with all this filling in forms and systems, it is super boring, right? So we automate all of this, and then you have star players who really change the environment for the company with suppliers that matter.
You also mentioned that it's important to join forces with your suppliers so they're part of your product development cycle. And in fact, when you do this, how much control should you give to your suppliers?
Maximum control. So in the end, this is, again, we're talking about the ones that matter, right? So
of course.
In the end, this is a competition for executive mindshare at the suppliers. You win if the key people at your suppliers spend more time thinking about your business than about the business of your competitors, right? So bring them in early, make sure, so listen to them, solicit their advice. If you say, okay, I want to launch this product, listen to them when they say, not so sure. I mean, because they work with other companies, right? So you can harvest market intelligence by listening to your suppliers, and also tell them that if they perform, they will automatically have the follow-on business, right? Because then they don't worry, oh my God, so this contract is coming to an end, will I get a new one, right? So they will never fully commit. But if you look at tech companies, right, so they very much play this long cycle, right? So they meet the suppliers on a quarterly basis, super high level engagements, and then basically they steer swim lanes, right? There's like a very broad swim lane for the main supplier, and then maybe one or two smaller, narrower swim lanes for other suppliers. But the suppliers know if they perform, they will have the business. And this is how companies like Foxconn grew tremendously, right? From a supplier making connectors to a $200 billion company.
Jonas, what do you think about what Christian is saying? How much control the supplier should be given?
Yes, I believe that the insight that your suppliers can actually give you information about the market is very valid. I think that's indeed one of the sort of I would say of competitive intelligence that is kind of invaluable in a way, because it's literally insider knowledge. So on that, I very much agree that leveraging that to the greatest extent, it's very good. I also agree that if you can have your suppliers that think more about you than that compared to thinking about anybody else, it is I would say it is a winning position. And by the way, I believe it is also true for software, not just hardware. So if you can do that with enterprise software vendors that are kind of suppliers, if those people can think about your use case more compared to all the other use cases that they have at hand, that I agree, it is very much strategic. And in this regard, indeed, having the CEO building the personal relationship, that I agree, this is the sort of things that cannot happen, without, I would say, very, very high level demonstration of commitment. That I agree. Now, what is also very interesting is that when I look at those tech companies, they play this game, but in the same time, they are also incredibly aggressive and successful in ensuring the commoditization of the layers that are below them. So you see, Microsoft did essentially completely commoditize the PC industry. So you see, there was, at the time when they started, there was like IBM having the whole chain, and then Microsoft came along with the operating system, and then when you wanted to sell a computer, Microsoft did manage to have very good relationship with plenty of other vendors, but ultimately, they completely commoditized the market for their greater benefits. And you can see that Apple is kind of doing the same with their ARM processors. Essentially, they are building a future where they will have plenty of options to play with other people. Yes, they're working with select suppliers, but they are also engineering a way where if they want to change their mind, they can. So it's, and I believe that they can be potentially incredibly brutal about that and literally wipe out those suppliers. So I would say yes, but I mean, again, I believe that this ingredient, this ruthlessness to kind of organize the commoditization of what is underneath you, it is very powerful. And I don't know. I mean, I don't have the final answer, but when I see those relationships both as a way to, yes, have tight relationship, but if you see also for the over 1 or 2 decades, you see that those companies have very frequently managed with this commoditization to get to the point where the supplier can basically be substitute given a few years, which create the question, because you see when we have those supply chains, one company has a supplier has their suppliers in turns, is that when you start engaging sort of tactics for the company, they can be very worried about being put in this sort of very weak position where suddenly they can be replaced down the road by somebody else, thanks to standardization and commoditization of whatever the supplier is providing.
So speaking of Apple, Jonas, Christian, you mentioned in your book that the key to Apple's grand success is that they put their suppliers at the core of their business. But what has their technological breakthrough, what role did that play to their success?
I mean, in the end, the tech industry, PC industry, right? I mean, yeah, this is very much in the end. You have a parts bin, right? So standardized components, and you configure these standardized components in a way that you have a unique product, right? And some companies are more successful in this, others less successful. So Apple, super successful, right? So they very much driven by industrial design, owning the entire tech stack, so not relying on Microsoft, for example, for the operating system. But I believe, I mean, this relying on relative standard components when it comes to memory, connector, and so on, right? Camera modules allows you then to double down where it makes a difference, right? And recently, Apple seems to put an emphasis on differentiating their products by power per watt. So how much computing power do you get for basically how much battery capacity, right? And super successful. So started doing this with the iPhone, right? Where the iPhone was typically 2 years ahead of anything available in the Android world in this regard. And now with more recently, they're doing the same thing with the laptops, right? With the MacBook, so what's now called the M series chips. Now we are a little bit disagree with Johannes is the way they treat their supplier here, right? So they are not shopping around. Yes, at the beginning they were shopping around a little bit, so they were going with Samsung, TSMC, Samsung. But I believe since 2015 or 16, they are now exclusively doing this with TSMC. And that's a mutually super rewarding relationship, right? So TSMC, as I said, so they I think last year they invested $40 billion in capex, and they can do this because they have this reliable revenue stream from Apple, and Apple has prime access to the latest process nodes, right? So right now it's 5 nanometers. Very soon it will be 4 or 3 nanometers, right? And this is a totally symbiotic relationship. So I don't believe that Apple can break away from TSMC without doing enormous damage to their business. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, TSMC cannot drop Apple without doing again enormous damage. So right now those two are married to each other, and I don't see this end anytime soon.
Yes, but you see, one of the difference, if I have to say, for example, Apple TSMC versus Microsoft Intel, one of the difference of the relationship is that by choosing for their CPU, for example, the ARM instruction set, essentially they are in a position where they are, for the same instruction set for the CPU, there are other manufacturers. You see, because ARM is just doing the blueprint for the ARM chips, but fundamentally it's other companies that produce those chips. So you see, it is, in a way, if we think, I'm not thinking, I completely agree with your statement, within the next 5 years, they are not going to move. But if we look further away, they are in a position where their CPU is fundamentally on the ARM instruction set with half a dozen of other companies who can potentially step in. That was not the case, by the way, for Microsoft, and it took, with Intel, it took AMD to basically copy the instruction set of Intel, and so they essentially to have AMD that was basically doing Intel-compatible chips for this to happen. With ARM, the interesting thing is that you already have, right from the start, half a dozen of companies that produce those ARM chips. So Apple pick one for they will have the best chips because that they blueprint, but how small can you execute it? Indeed, it's TSMC. But I see also an element of ruthlessness, which is go for an architecture that is standardized, independently from the chip maker, so that essentially 10 years, 20 years down the road, you can potentially change your mind. And this is happening pretty much at all the sort of layers. So yes, go super deep with one supplier while already thinking 10, 20 years ahead, the time when you want to break away. And by the way, Microsoft is now has actually tried with Windows RT to break away from essentially the Intel instruction set, but that didn't work. They had too much ecosystem that was kind of, I would say, entangled with it, and Windows RT was commercially a complete failure. I'm not sure if there is that many people who even remember that was like 5 years ago. But nonetheless, yes, I agree with you with the importance of the relationship. But you see, there is, again, I believe that's what you can get with incredibly smart procurement team, is that they can play also the super long game, which is the super profitable relationship for the next 5 years. And then 20 years down the road, the path where you can part ways if suddenly you're with a company that lost its edge. That is a bit like Intel was really the leading company at the hardware side, I would say, at the end of the 90s, but it's not that much, I would say, the leading edge 20 years later.
So we're rounding towards the end of our episode, and sort of towards the last question here. Essentially, in very unforeseeable circumstances when those hit, and I think the last, two years have been quite the example of when something unforeseeable has happened, and we end up on these so-called outliers in the supply chain. How can a good relationship with your supplier essentially save you in that situation? How important is it that you have sort of this human-to-human interactions with your suppliers? How does that differentiate you from other companies?
No, I think totally. I mean, I don't want to name too many names now, but if you look at the automotive industry, so in 2021, last year, the automotive industry lost 10 million vehicles to semiconductors. And then if you look at company by company, how much they lost, there are a couple of companies that basically fulfill the production plan, but they're operating in the same environment, right? And then this tells you some of them are doing this a lot better than others. And yes, I mean this comes down to an analysis, knowing how to do it, better teams, but ultimately it comes down, in my view, to better relationships to your suppliers, not just the tier one suppliers, but also the suppliers further down in the supply chain.
Christian, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your insights. It was very helpful and indeed very interesting to discuss this topic that you also outlined in your book. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.